Not everybody understands electricity 100%, and that's fine. Nobody expects you guys all to be electricians, but you're gonna have to know a little bit about electricity so you can stay safe in your RV. Today we're gonna be talking about dogbone adapters, what they do and what they don't do. We're gonna keep it short and sweet, but just enough information so that if you don't wanna wrap yourself around electrical knowledge, but you wanna know how to stay safe, stick around because we're gonna talk about just that. These dogbone adapters are really popular because you're not always going to have a 30 or 50 amp shore cord hookup. For instance, we are stepping down from a 30 amp shore cord hookup to a standard 20 amp receptacle here. So now the RV can be plugged in just like anything else. That doesn't mean that you can just run everything else just like you normally would. To keep things simple, again with a 30 amp or a 50 amp shore cord, that number, the higher it is, means the more amperage can flow through that shore cord. To simplify that a lot more, it's how much electricity can flow through it. So when you're reducing from a 50 amp or 30 amp shore cord down to a 20 amp, or you're going from a 50 amp down to a 30 amp using an adapter, you're limiting the amount of electricity that can safely go into your RV. So in a sense, you're limiting the amount of things that you can use in your RV. So if you have a 50 amp RV and you can typically run 2 or 3 air conditioners, but you go to a campsite that only has a 30 amp and you use a dogbone adapter to step down to a 30 and plug into that outlet, you're not going to be able to do those same things. You're actually going to have the same limitations that a 30 amp RV would have. And if you took a 30 or a 50 and stepped it down to a 20 amp receptacle, you're limited down to that 20 amps. Doesn't matter what the RV is capable of, it only matters what you're plugged into. You can only use as much power as you're able to get through that shore cord. And here's where it gets a little tricky and things like this start to happen. When you're plugged in like this, it's kind of hard to overload the electrical system in the RV or at the outlet here, because you have a 20 amp receptacle here that this is plugged into, which is protected somewhere down the line by a 20 amp breaker. Because your RV is a 30 amp, it's very unlikely your RV is going to exceed its limits. It's actually just going to trip this breaker for this circuit before anything happens. But what happens when you're going from a smaller number to a bigger number? In other words, what happens when you have a 30 amp RV, but all they have is a 50 amp outlet and you use an adapter to plug into that one? Well, now you're not as protected in your RV because the breaker that you're plugged into can handle 50 amps, but your RV can only handle 30. Now, luckily for you, your RV's main breaker is going to be a 30 amp breaker, so that could potentially trip before anything happens. But if that's true, then why do we see situations like this one when using certain adapters? There's actually a few reasons. The number one is you're just creating more connections. The more connections means the more points of resistance in the circuit. Resistance in the circuit create heat, especially under a heavy load. So let's say you were using a dogbone adapter, you've already added a bunch of connections to the main plug, points of resistance and points of heat, and let's say you're just running that thing right under its max, 28, 29 amps. Breaker's not going to get too hot. It was wired nicely in the panel. The breakers in your RV are wired nicely. What's going to take the hit is the loose connections. So again, that dogbone adapter being a connection point, especially if it's not clean or it's a really cheap dogbone adapter, the looser the connection is going to be. So it's going to generate a ton of heat and it's going to burn them up and melt them. Let me know in the comments if you or somebody you know has actually had that happen, because it is pretty common. You should always be very mindful of the energy you're consuming in your RV to make sure that you aren't overloading circuits or overloading the shore cord or the system as a whole. And you should always be extra cautious when using dogbone adapters, because again, this isn't changing anything. This 30 amp shore cord isn't going to be able to have 30 amps pass through it because we're stepped down to 20. Again, this is typically just fine because that circuit is protected for 20 amps. But those of you using an adapter to go from a 50 amp outlet to your 30 amp RV, that's usually where you have to watch out. And again, if you're using a dogbone adapter on like either a 30 or a 50, make sure you're being a little bit more mindful of your electricity, because now you've added other weak points of connection. Don't buy cheap shore cord connectors. If it seems like it's a really good deal, it's a really good deal for a reason. There is actually a difference in how the high quality ones are wired and the internals of them and how nice the connections are. It makes a huge difference, especially when it comes to that resistance and heat. So if you're one of the people that likes to use a dogbone adapter, there's no problem with that. Just know you have limitations. Monitor how much electricity you're using so that you can stay safe in your RV. If you want to see more RV tech tips, tricks, and even some tutorials, make sure you guys press that subscribe button.